Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. We've got a stack of documents here centered around a book titled Pogroms, An Inconvenient Truth, 1917-1921 by Nadia Leaps.
Pogroms, An Inconvenient Truth. That title alone tells you we're in for a stark examination. We're often told history is written by the victors, but this sounds different. It sounds like we're unearthing a story compiled really meticulously by someone driven by personal tragedy. What exactly are we diving into here?
Well, this deep dive confronts the uncomfortable truth, the mass murders of Jews in Ukraine between 1917 and 1921. This was, as you know, a period of intense civil war. And these atrocities, they were perpetrated by a horrifying array of groups. This includes significant elements fueled by a dangerous mix of Ukrainian nationalism and deeply ingrained anti-Semitism.
Okay.
Nadia Leaps' book, it's described as a documentary novel, which is quite a unique approach. It draws directly, unflinchingly, from primary documents found in the Kiev Regional Archive. So it offers this raw, often artistic, but always unflinching look at Ukrainian-Jewish relations during these Civil War pogroms. It particularly emphasizes the perpetrators and their motivations.
And it sounds like some of this is new information.
That's right. What makes this work so significant is that some of these critical documents, these photographs, they're being published for the very first time. It gives us really unprecedented access to this dark period. The author herself, Nadia Leaps, she notes she undertook this massive 7-year journey to understand the truth, however inconvenient it might be. And she was driven by her own family's profound loss in these very events.
Really? Her own family?
Yes. She recounts starting the book out of this desperate need to understand why there were so few Leaps family members left, only to discover their names appearing again and again in lists of the murdered. Her own great-great-grandfather, Froim Moshkovich Leaps, he lost at least 2 sons in these pogroms. And as she puts it quite starkly, he killed himself with cancer at the age of 56, having never spoken a single word of the horrors he witnessed.
Wow, that personal connection, it must underpin the entire work. It lends it this powerful emotional weight, doesn't it? An undeniable drive for truth.
Exactly. It's palpable throughout the research she presents. The landscape of terror. Setting the scene, 1917-1921.
Okay, let's try to unpack this. We're talking about 1917 to 1921. That's the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, smack bang in the middle of the Russian Civil War. What did that actually look like on the ground in Ukraine? How did that extreme instability set the stage for such widespread, horrific violence?
It was a period of unimaginable political and social upheaval. Utter chaos, really. Ukraine found itself as this constant, brutal battleground. You had multiple, often conflicting forces vying for control, which created this incredibly deadly environment where central authority was, well, virtually non-existent. Violence could erupt anywhere, anytime.
So who are these forces?
You had the Red Army, the Bolsheviks, pushing for Soviet control. Then there were various white armies like General Denikin's fighting to restore the old order. You also had the forces of Petliura's Ukrainian National Republic, the UNR, striving for an independent Ukraine. And then countless localized peasant insurgent groups, often driven by their own specific grievances and shifting allegiances.
And bandits, too, you mentioned.
Yes, and myriad local bandit formations, operating purely for plunder, taking advantage of the chaos. The source really highlights this continuous shifting of power. One army enters a town, then another replaces it days or weeks later. This complete lack of consistent central authority created an environment uniquely ripe for atrocities, particularly against the Jewish population.
And this was worse than earlier pogroms.
Much worse. It's crucial to understand that. Well, yes, earlier pogroms had occurred under the Tsars, and even during World War I by elements of the Russian and Polish armies. The author stresses that the Civil War-era pogroms were far, far more brutal. It wasn't just an escalation. It was a qualitative shift. New depths of violence, sadism, systematic destruction. It made the previous violence seem almost tragically mild by comparison.
So we're talking about a complete breakdown of order. What was the actual scale? You used the term mass murders. Can you give us some concrete numbers if the sources provide them? It's hard to even imagine.
The scale is truly staggering, almost incomprehensible. The report indicates an astounding 534 localities across Ukraine were subjected to pogroms during this 4-year period. 534.
534 towns and villages.
And not just once. Many suffered multiple times. Some endured 3, 5, even 10 separate pogroms.
Oh.
Think about the cumulative terror of that.
Unbelievable. And the human cost.
Well, precise numbers are notoriously hard to ascertain. Records were destroyed, countless victims were unnamed, sometimes because they were so brutally disfigured.
Oh, God.
But the established data points to at least 360,000 victims in total. 360,000.
Victims meaning killed, injured.
It breaks down like this. A horrific 160,000 people were killed outright. Another 100,000 were wounded. 50,000 became widows. And a heartbreaking 70,000 children were orphaned.
70,000 orphans.
And the author grimly states that for a Jewish population of around 3 million in Ukraine at the time, this meant the vast majority, nearly two-thirds, lost their entire economic base. Livelihoods, homes, security, gone. The fabric of Jewish life was just utterly torn apart.
How could they even document this at the time?
The challenges were immense, bordering on insurmountable. Imagine trying to identify bodies when, as the source notes, roughly 20% of the identified corpses were nameless, often hacked beyond recognition or burned alive. Identification was impossible, especially if entire families perished together, leaving no one behind to even try.
Are there specific examples?
Yes, horrifying ones. Like the small village of Dubovo, 810 people killed there, but over 600 of those victims were unrecognizable due to the sheer brutality. And the Committee for Aid to Victims, while trying valiantly to help survivors, especially the children, they struggled immensely. Compiling accurate lists of the dead, detailed accounts of losses, it was almost impossible in the chaos.
And the children?
Many children, the source states, simply forgot their Jewish origin when placed in orphanages or just left on the streets, effectively lost to their people. Another layer of tragedy caused by the terror and the societal breakdown. The roots of hatred. Why the pogroms?
Those numbers are just devastating. It leads to the unavoidable question. Why Jews? Why were they so consistently targeted by so many different groups during this chaos? The source mentions anti-Semitism, obviously, but what forms did that take? How did it become such a potent, destructive force?
That's the core, painful question, isn't it? And the author, Lipes, delves into these multifaceted causes. It's crucial to understand the distinction she makes between ideological anti-Semitism and everyday anti-Semitism.
Okay, what's the difference?
Ideological anti-Semites, she argues, were fewer in number, but they were the intellectual architects, the planners, the organizers. They conceptualized and orchestrated the violence, much like those who later planned the Holocaust. Their hatred was rationalized, articulated as part of some twisted political or social agenda.
And everyday anti-Semitism.
That was far more prevalent and perhaps more insidious in its own way. The author describes it as something ingrained with mother's milk, passed down through generations, often irrational. It didn't require direct contact with Jews. People could, she observes, genuinely hate Jews without ever having met one. It was just a societal default, a prejudice that simply was. It permeated the culture, the folklore, the common understanding, made Jews the convenient scapegoat for anything and everything.
And this had deep historical roots.
Very deep. Stemming from ancient times, Jewish distinctiveness, their refusal to fully assimilate. They insisted on maintaining their unique identity, their religious practices, their communal bonds. This naturally displeased everyone, as the source puts it, fostering an us versus them mentality. And unfortunately, both Christianity and Islam contributed over centuries with these widely propagated myths, the betrayal of Christ, rejecting prophets. These centuries-old narratives provided this powerful, almost subconscious religious and historical justification for the violence that exploded during the Civil War. It legitimized the hatred in the eyes of many.
So it wasn't just these ancient myths or vague inherited prejudices. Were there more immediate contemporary economic factors fueling this hatred?
Absolutely. Economic stereotypes played a huge and often overlooked role. They frequently fueled that everyday anti-Semitism we just discussed.
Like what specifically?
Well, Jews were commonly and very negatively associated with alcohol sales, the shinkers, the taverns. This became a pervasive, deeply damaging stereotype across Ukraine. Yet, the source points out the irony. Even when Jews were permitted to sell alcohol, they rarely controlled the pricing or the sales volumes. That was dictated by distillery and tavern owners.
So they were just employees, basically.
Often, yes, or tightly controlled franchisees. They were often prohibited from selling at lower prices. They had strict monthly sales quotas. If they didn't meet conditions, their contracts were terminated. Despite this limited control, the myth of Jews intoxicating peasants persisted right up to the revolution. A convenient narrative.
And the idea of Jewish wealth?
Yes, another deeply ingrained source of resentment. This pervasive, though often inaccurate, perception of Jewish wealth. Historically, sometimes Jews were invited to developed regions, granted temporary tax exemptions to encourage settlement. But even after these expired and were replaced by specific Jewish taxes, the state often forgot, to properly inform the surrounding non-Jewish population. So locals continued to believe Jews paid no taxes, unlike themselves, fueling deep envy, a sense of injustice.
And when they were restricted from certain trades.
Exactly. When forced to find new businesses due to severe restrictions, Jews often innovated, finding super profits in nascent industries, things that didn't exist yet, so couldn't be immediately banned. But this entrepreneurial spirit, vital for their survival, quickly led to those new ventures being banned too. But the public memory of Jewish dominance remained, intensifying resentment.
And this perception of wealth was exploited during the pogroms.
Directly, the source highlights the stereotype. Jews were seen as non-drinking, cunning, and always stood by each other. This translated into a belief in their collective wealth, their ability to pay ransoms. Armed groups would seize hostages, community leaders usually, believing the community would pay for their release by temporary safety. And communities did try. They desperately tried to buy safety until they literally ran out of money by mid-1919, utterly broke and defenseless. This perception of wealth was a direct motivator for plunder.
Beyond the historical, religious, economic tensions, there's this powerful political narrative, the conflation of Jew with Bolshevik. How did that specific accusation take hold and spread so virulently? It seems incredibly dangerous.
It was incredibly dangerous and tragically incredibly convenient for the perpetrators. In 1919, the main slogan shouted during pogroms wasn't "beat the communists" and Yids, two separate enemies. No, it was a single combined enemy. Beat the communists as Yids, or down with the commune and Yids. The phrasing, as the source highlights, explicitly meant beat the Yids because they are all communists. This horrifying formula, this dangerous ideological shorthand, spread like wildfire across Ukraine, became a universal justification.
Even early on.
Yes, even early on. December 1918 in Overich, an ataman named Kosir Zerka chillingly told a local rabbi, quote, "I know you are a Bolshevik, that all your relatives are Bolsheviks, that all Yids are Bolsheviks. Know that I will exterminate all Yids in the city. Go to the synagogue and warn them." The message was clear, uncompromising, utterly illogical.
Is a blanket accusation.
Exactly. It became this devastating justification for violence. Didn't matter if the targets were elderly, women, children. The label Yid Bolshevik was enough to condemn them. It was widely believed, despite its absurdity, that all Jews were interconnected. A single Jewish leadership that could magically influence Jewish Bolsheviks, like a monolith.
And officials believe this too.
Some high-ranking ones certainly propagated it. General Denikin, leader of the Whites, responding to desperate pleas to stop the pogroms, basically said Jewish representatives could influence Jewish Bolshevik detachments, end quote, passing the buck to the victims. Similarly, prominent Ukrainian figures like V. Vinichenko, who was premier of the Directory government for a time, claimed pogroms couldn't stop as long as Jewish youth and workers supported Bolsheviks. Again, conveniently ignoring the reality, shifting blame.
But what was the reality? How many Jews actually were Bolsheviks?
Very few, actually. The source painstakingly points this out using election results, demographic analysis. Most Jewish majority towns, Bolsheviks typically got only 4th or 5th place in elections, significantly less popular than other parties.
Can you give an example?
Sure. In Berdichev, 77% Jewish population, less than 10% voted Bolshevik. Uman, 57% Jewish. Bolsheviks were third, with less than 10%. Now, in larger industrial centers like Odessa, Katerinoslav, Jewish support for Bolsheviks was higher, yes, but that reflected the broader working class and military presence in those diverse cities, not some specific Jewish affinity for Bolshevism.
So the vast majority of victims,
the overwhelming majority nonpartisan women, children, the elderly, were certainly not Bolsheviks. Yet they were massacred under that same devastating justification. This narrative, beat the Jews, save Ukraine, it perfectly merged the nationalist aspirations of some, particularly elements within the Ukrainian national movement, with that deeply ingrained anti-Jewish hatred. It provided a powerful, though utterly false and murderous, rallying cry. It allowed perpetrators to feel like patriots, not criminals, the actors in their atrocities. Who carried out the pogroms?
So it sounds like a truly terrifying mix of perpetrators. Different motivations, plunder, power, ideology, but tragically united by this pervasive anti-Jewish sentiment, often wrapped in political slogans. Who were these different groups and what characterized their actions? It sounds like a zoo, as the source put it.
It really was a horrific zoo of forces, each contributing to the brutality in their own way. First, you had the regular armies.
Not just bandits, actual armies.
Yes, both the Russian army and Polish troops had already started pogroms during WWI. During the Civil War, this continued chillingly. Denikin's White Army, Petliura's UNR forces the Ukrainian National Republic Army, and even some Red Army units engaged in pogroms. Though it should be noted, Soviet authorities later conveniently disavowed those Red Army actions as mutinous or undisciplined.
How did armies use pogroms?
Often as military strategy. Terrorizing the population into submission, demoralizing opponents, or just letting soldiers enrich themselves through looting. A breakdown of discipline, sometimes actively encouraged. For instance, in Kremenchug, Denikin's forces systematically robbed 85% of the Jewish population. Widespread rapes, and disturbingly, officers often condoned it, denied it, or even participated in dividing the spoils.
They even tried to cover it up.
Yes, the source recounts a chilling detail. Some commanders would actually demand certificates from Jewish communities, coerced under threat, stating their regiment behaved decently, even after demanding massive payments and overseeing brutality.
Yeah.
It shows the facade they tried to maintain. In Poltava, Denikin's army killed and robbed, while the local newspaper Voice of the South actively fueled anti-Semitic and anti-Ukrainian propaganda, fanning the flames.
Okay, so regular armies were involved. Then the bandit formations.
Right, the bandit formations. Local, often paramilitary groups. Leaders like Golub, Zeleny, Sokol, Mohammed, Volinist, notorious names. Their main motive was raw plunder, personal gain. They'd descend on towns, often claiming to fight for independent Ukraine or restoring order, but their real aim was systematic robbery and violence.
How did they justify it?
Accusing Jews of speculation, poisoning wells, even the ancient blood libel myth of drinking Christian children's blood. Fabricated charges as pretext for extreme brutality. These groups were especially brutal because they sought only plunder. No interest in administration or long-term control, just smash and grab.
Any specific examples stand out?
The source mentions Sokol. He was a former Chekist, a Soviet secret police agent, shows you the fluidity of allegiances, the total breakdown of norms. Sokol massacred the entire Jewish population of Volodarka, burned Jewish homes, and literally wiped the town off the map, from state agent to brutal bandit. Just horrific.
That's terrifying. But you mentioned a third group, perhaps the most disturbing.
Yes. Perhaps the most disturbing detail, the most inconvenient truth here, is the active participation of what the author calls the ordinary Ukrainian population. Neighbors.
Neighbors turning on neighbors.
Exactly. These were the pogroms, the source states, that caused the maximum material damage and led to a significant reduction, sometimes total eradication, of the Jewish population in specific places. These neighbors would help identify Jewish homes, hiding places for the soldiers or bandits. They'd often accompany the perpetrators, making sure nothing valuable was missed. And they actively participated in the looting.
Women and children, too.
In Cherkasy, yes. Local townsfolk, including women and children, willingly took part in the looting, pointing out Jewish homes to soldiers. The source also describes instances. After bandits or soldiers left, local peasants would set fire to Jewish homes. Not just destruction, but scavenging the wood for fuel, for building materials, making absolutely sure there was nothing left for Jews to return to.
So it wasn't just outsiders.
No. In Makov, when Bolsheviks retreated and Petliurists advanced, it was the local peasantry who took active part in the looting. It shows how readily communities could turn on their Jewish neighbors. This level of intimate complicity. It paints a truly grim picture of a society where hatred and greed overrode basic humanity.
And the methods of killing. You mentioned they were particularly brutal.
Varied and gruesome, reflecting this terrifying creativity and cruelty far beyond just warfare. Shooting was common, yes, but sometimes ammunition was conserved. In Proskurov, Ataman Semisenko ordered only cold weapons used. Jews killed with sabers, bayonets, hacked to pieces.
And evil.
Drowning was used in the Chernobyl district. Jews driven to rivers, forced or thrown in, shot if they tried to swim, infants torn apart, the elderly hanged, bodies dismembered to prevent identification, denying families even the chance to mourn properly, erasing people from records, and the scale of sexual violence, immense. Kremenchug alone, over 600 rapes recorded. Many women died from internal injuries. It wasn't just killing, it was terrorizing, humiliating, utterly destroying the fabric of life, often with this perverse theatricality to instill maximum fear.
This raises that profoundly disturbing question again. What about the local Christian population, the intelligentsia? During these horrors, did they stand by? Did they try to help? What did the sources say?
It was, as I said, a mixed bag, but overwhelmingly the response was passivity. The author states Christians generally regarded the pogroms negatively, but passively. There were rare exceptions, but they were rare, often complicated. Some peasants in Zarichai reportedly tried to take looted items, throw them in the water, a possible flicker of conscience. But then there's a contradictory account from a former State Duma member claiming Zarichai peasants actually joined Cossacks in looting, while Russian intellectuals tried to retrieve stolen goods. It shows how fragmented the testimony is, but the overall picture is a population largely overwhelmed, complicit, or just too afraid.
Did anyone try to hide people?
Some Christians did, commendably, hide Jews and their property, risking their own lives. But tragically, the source notes, often the property was then kept by the rescuers afterwards. Others outright refused shelter. Fear, indifference. The Ukrainian intelligentsia largely went underground, absent from the scene. Fear, maybe lack of moral courage. The Russian intelligentsia, often former officials, showed no desire to paralyze these horrific events or even weaken the tempo. Some teachers did intercede with military authorities, but efforts were often timid and indecisive. Limited influence.
Were there any positive examples?
Yes, in places like Telnoy, a priest and other Christian figures did actively try to help, collected funds for victims, orphans. A physician noted their brave efforts. But these were exceptions. Crucially, the widespread rumor fabricated, never official policy that anyone caught hiding Jews would be shot, that often deterred aid. It shows a psychological warfare. Creating a climate of fear that isolated victims further, broke down any remaining solidarity, resilience, and disappointment. Jewish responses.
Faced with such extreme systemic violence and this widespread apathy or even complicity, what could Jewish communities even do? How did they try to protect themselves? Did they get any support?
Well, they tried, with incredible courage and desperation, to organize self-defense. In many places, these self-defense units were remarkably robust, like paramilitary organizations. They set up headquarters, acquired arms depots, organized round-the-clock patrols. Astonishing resilience and ingenuity in the face of existential threat, often joined by members of socialist parties influencing their structure, their spirit.
Were they effective?
Sometimes, remarkably so. The source highlights the night patrol in Bohuslav. They fought off bandits, even repelled Denikin's retreating white forces, gained such a reputation that neighboring villages, Jewish and non-Jewish, sought their protection, asked for instructors. In Bilat Tserkva, self-defense units sometimes repelled large military units. Incredible courage. They even won battles against disintegrating military units or known bandit groups like the Hedemaski Keren, who threatened pogroms if they weren't disarmed. It shows active agency, often overlooked.
But you said there was a problem.
Yes, a consistent, devastating problem. These effective self-defense units were often disarmed or dissolved by various authorities just before a pogrom, left them utterly defenseless.
By who?
Petliura's forces disarmed the unit in Vasilkov in February 1919, right before violence erupted. The Soviets, while sometimes punishing individual pogromists mostly for maintaining order, not sympathy, remember they also executed Jews as speculators, often refused to legalize Jewish self-defense. They insisted Jews join regular Red Army units. Deeply problematic. These mixed units often fled in panic, leaving Jews vulnerable. Or, worse, were local peasants who wouldn't defend Jews against their own villagers.
So disarming was systematic.
It happened repeatedly. Whether deliberate design or callous indifference, it directly exposed the Jewish population to more atrocities, stripped them of their last defense.
Beyond self-defense, what other forms of community support existed for the victims?
Jewish communities, often with vital help from international Jewish organizations, especially American donors, established desperate aid committees, aimed to provide essential material aid, support the massive number of orphans, combat rampant epidemics like typhus, a huge killer, due to lack of clothes, shelter, medicine, and help restore destroyed livelihoods.
Practical help.
Very practical. Food, clothing, tools for artisans, shoemakers, tailors, because locals often couldn't or wouldn't provide these goods once Jewish businesses were destroyed. But the difficulties were immense. Chronic lack of resources, ongoing chaos, deep mistrust, Soviet money, often refused by fearful peasants, even gathering accurate lists of victims, tracking aid, a bureaucratic nightmare on top of a humanitarian catastrophe.
You mentioned the political leanings earlier, contradicting the Jew equals Bolshevik myth. Can you elaborate on that? What parties did Jews support?
Right, it directly refutes that propaganda. Before 1917, Jews largely supported liberal or left-centrist parties' reform, integration. After the revolution, in the Ukrainian gubernias provinces, they supported a wide spectrum. Various Jewish national parties, Volkspartei, Bund, Pola Zion, Representing different facets of Jewish political thought, socialist, nationalist, cultural autonomy, self-determination, they also supported Ukrainian parties like the Ukrainian Socialist Revolutionaries, UPSR, and all Russian parties, Cadets, Mensheviks, SRs.
So really diverse.
Absolutely. And remember, in most Jewish majority towns, Bolsheviks were 4th or 5th place in elections, significantly less popular. Berdichev, Uman, less than 10% Bolshevik vote despite large Jewish populations, higher support in big industrial cities like Odessa, Ekaterinoslav. Yes, but that reflected the broader working class military presence, not a specific Jewish affinity.
So the diversity of political thought.
It clearly shows how inaccurate, baseless, and malicious the Jew equals Bolshevik accusation was. Purely a convenient pretext for violence, nothing more. The haunting legacy and the inconvenient truth.
This has been truly harrowing. Laying bare a chapter that feels almost too painful to comprehend. What are the lasting consequences? And what are these profound, inconvenient truths that Nadia Lapis really tries to hammer home through this documentation?
The consequences were catastrophic,
Right.
decimating Jewish life in Ukraine for generations. Mass deaths, overwhelming numbers of orphans, widespread injuries, rampant disease like typhus killing long after the violence stopped, and the complete systematic destruction of communities. Places like Sibulev. Jewish population dropped from 2,000 to just 20. Justingrad, 2,900 down to 25.
It's like ripped out.
Essentially, homes destroyed, taken over by neighbors, scavenged for materials, even Jewish cemeteries plowed over, sown with grain, deliberately erasing any physical trace, denying future generations a place to mourn or remember. The physical, economic, moral landscape obliterated, leaving a void.
And the perpetrators, what was the consequence for them?
That's one of the most glaring, deeply inconvenient truths, the almost complete lack of punishment. The source repeatedly notes pogromists rarely face significant consequences, maybe a short time in prison, then they magically disappear, often joining another military unit, another bandit group, continuing the terror elsewhere.
So no real justice.
Very little. Years later, many were killed, yes, but not for their pogrom activities, killed in the ongoing Civil War chaos or later Soviet purges unrelated to their crimes against Jews. The author notes, with biting sarcasm, even Soviet courts, when they did try pogromists, sometimes gave light sentences. Forced labor, especially for educated perpetrators, implying they should have known better but got leniency instead, suggests systemic indifference toward violence against Jews, even from the new Soviet regime.
And the Bolsheviks.
They did consistently punish pogromists, but the source states explicitly, primarily for maintaining order as central authority, not out of specific sympathy. They also regularly executed Jews as speculators or counter-revolutionaries. So, pervasive lack of justice overall, no accountability, no closure, impunity.
Another inconvenient truth you mentioned was contradictory narratives.
Yes, profoundly contradictory, self-serving narratives of blame. Predictable? Maybe. All sides blamed each other. Bolsheviks blamed Denikin. Denikin blamed Bolsheviks. All agreed Petliura and the bandits were evil. But the bandits often spun their own justifications, fighting for independent Ukraine. All Yids were Bolsheviks, making massacres seem patriotic. The author starkly contrasts accounts of Jewish historian Krimovich and Russian priest Gusev Orenbursky. Both used the exact same archival material, reached diametrically opposite conclusions about culprits' motivations.
How is that possible?
It highlights how narratives are shaped by bias, political agenda, the desire to absolve one's own side. Makes reconstructing a shared understanding incredibly difficult. Facts alone don't always lead to the same conclusion if interpreted through different lenses. History gets weaponized.
And finally, the systematic nature. It wasn't just random chaos.
No. And this is perhaps the most poignant truth. Some pogroms were pre-planned and carried out according to a specific plan, with intellectuals involved in orchestrating, locals actively assisting. Not just spontaneous mob violence. The terror often involved a chilling, methodical process.
Targeted looting and murder. Sometimes by intellectuals not needing money, but doing their work as amateurs or following orders like Fyodorovsky, reminded of Ataman Grigoriev's order to kill.
Intentional dismantling of Jewish homes for materials, ensuring nowhere to return, no community to rebuild.
Total cleansing of the territory to seize all Jewish property. Calculated ethnic cleansing for economic gain.
That vile, unprecedented tactic, spreading fabricated rumors about executing Christians who hid Jews, making hiding incredibly dangerous, isolating victims, eliminating aid.
That's chillingly calculated.
It is. The author concludes heavily that these horrors were preventable if the local population had been truly interested in preventing them, if there had been a widespread moral will to resist. That speaks volumes about the societal environment that allowed this to unfold and endure.
This deep dive has truly laid bare an inconvenient truth, hasn't it? a period often glossed over, deliberately forgotten. The detail, equaling, the scale, the motivations, including nationalist elements and local participation, the systematic destruction, it's truly disturbing. It feels like the sheer brutality, the chaos, almost designed to erase the evidence as well as the lives.
It absolutely underscores the extreme fragility of intercommunal relations in times of chaos. How easily ingrained prejudices, especially anti-Semitism, can be weaponized for political gain, economic gain, even under guise of nationalism or revolution. The consistent inability or outright unwillingness of various authorities to protect the Jewish population, and in many cases their active participation or tacit approval. It's a stark reminder of what happens when a community is deemed disposable, when their suffering is normalized, justified.
It's a sobering thought, especially the author's remark you mentioned earlier that individuals once called cannibals for their roles in these horrors are now, a century later, having monuments erected in their honor. That says so much about historical memory, how it's manipulated.
Indeed. It raises a truly important question for all of us, doesn't it? What lessons can we draw from this period about how historical narratives are shaped, reshaped over time, often serving present-day political agendas, whitewashing the past, conveniently shifting blame? And what responsibility do we have, you and I and everyone listening, as individuals, as societies, to confront even the most uncomfortable truths of the past, rather than letting them be selectively remembered, distorted, or forgotten entirely?
It's a powerful reminder that history, however painful, must be understood in its full, inconvenient truth, not just remembered selectively.
Exactly. Understood, not just remembered.